All right, so Claude Code and Codex are going head to head right now, and the gap is way bigger than I expected. Blind code reviewers picked Claude Code's output 67% of the time versus Codex's 25% on the exact same tasks, and that's not close. Both tools just got major updates, and the pricing has shifted enough that the old advice doesn't hold. So I'm comparing Claude Code versus Codex across 4 real tests: code editing, cost per task, CLI depth, and context window, and every number traces back to a verified source. No vendor money involved. Honestly, the final score is going to surprise you because the tool that wins on code quality is not the one most developers actually reach for every day. And understanding why that tension exists is kind of the whole point of this video. So who is this for? If you're a developer deciding where to point your daily workflow, or a team trying to figure out which tool to standardize on, this is the comparison you want, because we're talking about real cost differences in the hundreds of dollars per task and context window gaps that change how you work on large code bases. And getting this wrong is expensive. Test 1 is multi-file editing accuracy, and this one matters a lot because most real work isn't editing one file in isolation. You're touching database migrations, API routes, and test files all at once. And if the tool drops the ball across files, you spend more time debugging than coding. Okay, so here's what the data shows. On SWE Bench Verified, Codex scores 88.7% versus Claude Code's 87.6%. So Codex has a narrow edge there, but on the blind code quality review of the same Express.js refactor, Claude Code won 67% of evaluations versus Codex's 25%. And I treat the SWE bench number as directional rather than definitive, since these are different test setups. Claude Code wins this one. The blind review result, 67% to 25%, is a much stronger signal than a 1 point SWE bench gap, because real reviewers picked Claude Code's actual output as cleaner, and that puts Claude Code up 1-0 on the scoreboard so far. This test 2 is cost per coding task. And honestly, this is the one that trips people up the most, because a tool can be technically better and still wreck your budget if you're literally hammering it all day, and cost per task is what determines whether this is a productivity tool or a money pit. So on an identical documented Express.js refactor, Claude Code costs about $155 and Codex costs about $15, which is roughly 10 times cheaper for Codex. And it comes down to token efficiency, since Codex uses about 4 times fewer tokens on the same task, with Claude Code's sub-agent fanout being the main cost driver, which is worth knowing before you kick off a big refactor. Codex takes this one. A 10 times per task cost difference puts you in a completely different budget category. And that ties things up at 1-to-1, with the next 2 tests mattering a lot. Now, the gap is real, but it's not the whole story, because Claude Code's max 20 times plan at $200 a month covers $600 to $1,500 worth of API equivalent tokens. So if you're a heavy user, the subscription math can actually flip in Claude Code's favor. And the 10x advantage for Codex applies most clearly to moderate usage without a subscription cap. Test 3 is terminal and CLI integration depth. And if your workflow lives in the shell and you want your AI coding tool to plug into linting, CI pipelines, or custom scripts, this is the test that tells you which tool is actually built for that. Because shallow CLI support means you're doing a lot of manual work around the tool. Claude Code exposes 17 named lifecycle hooks, things like pre-tool use and post-tool use, so you can trigger linting or block dangerous commands automatically on every single tool call. And Codex CLI has no published equivalent. Though Codex does have 3 clean autonomy modes and OS-level sandboxing with Apple Seatbelt and Linux Landblock, which is genuinely solid. But the hook depth just isn't there. Claude Code wins this one too. Because 17 lifecycle hooks versus none documented is a clear gap in automation depth. And that puts Claude Code ahead 2-1 on the scoreboard with 1 more test to go. That said, if you care about open source, Codex CLI wins. It's Apache 2.0 with over 67,000 GitHub stars, meaning your team can audit, fork, and extend it in ways Claude Code simply doesn't allow. And Codex's 3-mode autonomy setup is honestly cleaner and more transparent for teams that want predictable behavior without a lot of configuration. Test 4 is context window for large repos, and this one is really practical. If you're working on a monorepo or a code base with hundreds of files, a small context window means you're constantly managing what's loaded instead of just working, because the context limit is basically the ceiling on how much your tool can actually see at once. Claude Code's max and team plans come with a 1 million token window by default, which works out to about 830,000 usable tokens after the compaction buffer, while Codex defaults to 272,000 tokens, roughly 258,000 usable. And Codex does have a 1.05 million long mode, but it's not on by default, and it hits a 2x input plus 1.5 times output billing penalty above 272,000. So it gets expensive fast. Claude Code wins the final test, because 830,000 usable tokens on by default versus 258,000 is a real workflow difference for anyone working on large code bases. And that brings the final score to Claude Code 3, Codex won across all 4 tests. I want to be honest here though, the 1 million token number is a ceiling, not a guarantee, because community reports show accuracy starts degrading around 400,000 to 600,000 tokens, so you're not getting full performance all the way to the top. And for most everyday tasks, Codex's 272,000 default is honestly enough, so take the context win with a grain of salt if your repos aren't massive. So here's where Claude Code clearly beats Codex. Blind reviewers picked its code output 67% of the time versus 25% on the same tasks. It has a 1 million token default context for loading entire mono repos. It has 17 lifecycle hooks for deep CLI automation. And the max 20 times plan at $200 a month can cap costs at a level that actually makes sense for heavy daily use. And here's where Codex clearly beats Claude Code. It costs $15 versus $155 on a documented identical refactor, which is roughly 10 times cheaper. It uses about 4 times fewer tokens on the same task. It scored 82% on Terminal Bench 2.0 versus Claude Code's 69.4%, which is a meaningful gap if your workflow is shell heavy. And it's open source under Apache 2.0 with 67,000 plus GitHub stars, so your team can actually inspect and extend it. So here's the decision rule. If you're doing complex large repo work where code quality matters and you want deep CLI automation, Claude Code is worth the cost. But if you're running high volumes of smaller tasks and cost per task is what you're watching, Codex is the better unit economics call. And I think it's worth saying this isn't binary. It really does come down to what you're optimizing for.